Those of you who do not know me, I'm Aran Keshavarzian. I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you and host our guest speakers for today's panel discussion of Heroes and Hostages, America and Iran, 1880 to 1988, written by Professor Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet. I will say more about the book and the event in a moment, but let me bring to your attention, this is our last event for the academic year, but thank you all who've, I think many of you are so-called repeat customers who've been with us throughout the academic year, including people who actually, I think were on the very first panel who've come back to join us on the last event. Yes, yes. So, okay, I've been told that there is a I misspoke. This is the last Iranian Studies event that is only an Iranian Studies event, but we're very lucky that on April 30th, there's a co-sponsored event with the Ottoman and Turkish Studies program and the Iranian Studies Initiative that you should, we will email you the specifics also. So look out for an event for on the 30th. I apologize, I was not on top of that. But this is the last event that's a solely Iranian Studies event. But so let me take an opportunity to share some thanks and gratitude for everyone that makes these events possible. Let me first of all actually thank colleagues at the Iran 1400 project. If you're not familiar, Iran 1400 is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the production and dissemination of knowledge about Iran. The mission of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage a conversation rather than shouting and posturing. I'm quoting from their mission statement. The mission of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage a conversation rather than shouting and posturing among Iranians and interested observers. It's an attempt to make a constructive contribution to understanding Iran, to educate people broadly about Iran itself, and to encourage the Iranian people to reflect on what future they want. Iran 1400 is a registered 501c or nonprofit organization. It is an endeavor with no political aspirations. Its purpose is to build and host a body of knowledge, a mosaic of evaluations of the challenges and the possibilities facing Iran as it navigates the new century. So we're fortunate to have their support for this specific event. I believe this is the first time that we're collaborating with Iran 1400, and I believe some of their members of their board are with us on the Zoom, and maybe in the question and answer they would like to pose some questions. Second, I'd like to thank Sage Taber, who is not here, but just so you know, she's one of the many invisible laborers behind the scenes. She's in charge of all the communications, all those emails that you love to receive about our events. Sage manages all of that, and we're very thankful for all of her work this past academic year. I should add, we're also very thankful to the wonderful staff at the Kevorkian Center, specifically Amanda and Andrea, and the various grad student workers who behind the scenes make all of this possible, from the seating to the tech to the Zoom and all of that. So thanks to everyone. And last but not least, let me thank Ali Mispasi, who steers the Iranian Studies Initiative and is very much the mind behind many of these events and the programming. I've lost track of how many years we've been doing this. I think we're approaching 13 or 14 years at this point. 15, Ali corrects me, 15 years. So, and I appreciate all his efforts and his dedication. And I thank all of you who come to many of our events, and you occasionally send emails, some of which are actually complimentary. So I appreciate those. Those emails that aren't complimentary, we thank you for taking the time to vent. So let me turn to our wonderful event for this evening. It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker and today's event. As I mentioned, it's built around A recent publication was published in late 2023, Heroes to Hostages, America and Iran, 1800 to 1988, by Professor Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet. We will begin with Professor Kashani-Sabet, who will have approximately 30 minutes to share with us the main themes, motivations, and features or challenges in writing this wonderfully original book. Professor Firoozeh Kashani-Sabet is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, although she's a New Yorker through and through, for those of you who are wondering. She is a prolific and highly accomplished historian that has written on an array of topics, including identity politics, encompassing race, ethnicity, and gender, as well as various aspects of diplomacy. She has published several significant, in fact, I would say seminal works that have forced us and Iranian studies in general to reconsider Iranian nationalism, gender, motherhood, and Iran's place in the wider Middle East. Prior to the publication of Heroes and Hostages, that, as I mentioned, was published a few months ago, she has authored 2 major monographs, Frontier Fictions, Shaping the Iranian Nation, which was published in 1999 by Princeton University Press, as well as Conceiving Citizens, Women and Politics of Motherhood in Iran, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. I'm pretty sure both have been, I'm positive, in fact, that both have been translated into Persian and in fact are widely read and discussed amongst Iranian students, intellectuals in Tehran and beyond. She has also published a novel, Martyrdom Street, which came out in 2010. Unfortunately, I have not had a chance to read that, but when I was putting together my notes, I've made a note that I should put it on my summer reading list. Last but not least, I should add that Professor Kashani-Sabet is currently the president of the Association of Iranian Studies, and I think is the reason why many of us are looking forward to the biannual conference in Mexico City in August. Thank you for organizing that. After Firoozeh's presentation, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Christopher Dietrich, another historian of the 20th century, and also a veteran of the Iranian Studies series, just like Firoozeh is. Dr. Dietrich is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Initiative on the History of Global Capitalism at Fordham University. He's the author of Oil Revolution, Anti-Colonial Elites, Sovereign Rights, and the Economic Culture of Decolonization, which came out in 2017 and was published by Cambridge University Press. This is an important history of the struggle over oil, including struggles in Iran, that centers on the role of lawyers, engineers, and economists in oil-producing countries as they sought to wrest control over the oil industries as part of a broader struggle for self-determination and economic sovereignty. He's also the editor of Diplomacy and Capitalism, the Political Economy of U.S. Foreign Relations, which was published a couple of years ago by University of Pennsylvania Press, as well as being the co-editor of The Power and Politics and World series at the University of Pennsylvania Press. So Chris will have about 8 to 10 minutes to share his thoughts and questions and reflections on the book. I also had the pleasure of reading Heroes and Hostages, and I will also add my own comments and reflections after Chris's presentation. Then we will kind of return to Firoozeh. She can pick up some threads or reflect on anything that Chris and I had shared, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I suspect we'll have a good 30 minutes, if not longer, for your comments and questions. Comments and questions for the panelists. Good news I want to share is that we have, it looks like 8 copies of Heroes and Hostages. I've been told by Ali Misbasi that you're welcome to come up at the end and pick up a copy, maybe, ask the author to kindly sign it for you. And Ali says that if you have $20 to contribute for the books, that would be great. If you don't, we'll take an IOU, I guess. So we'll leave these up here, and then with that, I will hand the floor over to Firoozeh.
Can you hear me? It's loud. Good evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Kashani-Sabet, for your very generous introduction, and for taking the lead in organizing this. Also, Dr. Misapwesi, Dr. Dietrich, for giving of your time, not only to read my book, but also to engage with it. So I'm really grateful. I'm also grateful to all of you for coming out on such a dreary day. It's not easy. It's not always, it's sometimes hard to get yourself places. Believe me, I know this as a commuter. But so I'm deeply grateful that you've all taken the time to do so. And thank you also for your very generous introduction. I'm not sure that I deserve it, but I am grateful for it. So I'm just going to begin from the beginning, which is that, for many of us who are Iranian, this is also a personal story. For me, I went to a school in Tehran called the Community School, which was partially English curriculum and Persian. We always had a lot of homework. We had to write our homework in 2 languages every night. I'm grateful for that, but I try to do that with my kids, and it just didn't go anywhere. So just goes to show that the educational system in Iran, whatever it is, has a lot of good qualities, and always has, I think, despite some, maybe antiquated techniques. And so, and this was also a personal journey for me. As I say in the introduction to the book, 2 of my uncles came to the United States to study. My mom did, but she left, so she never really finished. I think there was a lot of pressure on her to get married. I shouldn't say that, but she's not here, so I can say that, but you can't repeat it. That's right. Oh, oops. Oh, we can like take this part out. And my uncles, came here. They didn't know English. And they ended up marrying Americans. One stayed here and one returned to Iran. And he had a very, interesting career as a medical doctor. He started in the University of Shiraz, which also had a relationship with the University of Pennsylvania, for those of you who know. And he did his military service. Anyway, fast forward, the revolution happens, and he and his family end up coming to the United States, but not before he operated on Rafsanjani, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, when he was shot just after the revolution. I'm not going to tell him all, I'm not going to divulge right now since it's being recorded. Over dinner, I'll probably share some more stories. And so the long and short of it is that this is, of course, a story that is very personal on the one hand, but also it was a way for me to try to figure out my own kind of relationship with this fraught history between the United States and Iran. And at first, I started the project right after 9/11. My chair at the department, in my department at Penn, the late Jonathan Steinberg, he really thought it was a good idea. I was on the tenure track. He wanted me to write a book that was a little bigger, more sort of timely, I guess. But I had a hard time wrapping my head around it. And I one time told him, I said, you don't really need to be me as a historian to write this book. I mean, little Persian, little English, you'll be able to write it. And he really, he said no. He said, you have your perspective, particularly as a woman, and the family background that I experienced. I mean, I just explained. But I have to say that in the process of writing it, I am not a diplomatic historian. I'm a social and cultural historian. And so I really had to figure out a way to write this book in a way that was true to me, which was to build on some of the diplomacy that, of course, informs any work on America and Iran, but that also is true to me as a person and as a historian, which is my engagement with social themes and cultural themes. And so once I figured that out, I was able to kind of work on it. And as I started to write, I think the 19th century sections of the book were really interesting to me because in some of the available newspaper material in Persian from the Qajar period, particularly in the late 19th century. There were a lot of references to Americans, also to the missionaries, also some concern about the missionary mission of conversion. So that was all very interesting, but also Iran's vulnerability, Iran's fascination with the United States as from the Iranian sort of mindset, this little country, you know, with 13 colonies suddenly becomes this incredible empire. And so many of the articles that were written in the late 19th century were actually about that. And the sense of, you know, sort of the great men, George Washington being one of them in one of the constitutional newspapers. And also some of the imagery of, you know, Iran being surrounded by imperialist powers, which in one case also did include the United States in 1912, probably one of the earliest things that I found referencing the United States as an imperial power in this time period. And as I sort of looked at this history, of course, the matter of gender is always important to me. And, you know, going into the sort of the 1920s and so forth, and Reza Shah's controversial unveiling decree, which was very, very carefully documented. In my lecture classes at the University of Pennsylvania, I often highlight this this minister, or this, I guess he was a minister, William Hornibrook. I really like this person. I don't know who he is. Very few people know who he is. But he was so prescient, and he had such a depth of understanding of Iranian society in the 1930s for someone who actually had not been stationed in Iran for very long, you know, and he really had the pulse of this country, ironically. And he was so suspicious of all these top-down sort of secular reforms that were taking place. He would go to these diplomatic, you know, gatherings where the wives of officials were there unveiled, but there was always this like sort of this almost sinister sense that, you know, something isn't quite right, you know. And I just have really admired this person, you know. I hope, I mean, I wish there was a way that I could, you know, maybe, you know, even learn more about him. But it was eye-opening for me, because, you know, oftentimes when we look at the history of the United States and Iran, you know, sometimes in a very stereotypical way, it is said that, you know, foreign personnel didn't really have a good understanding of Iran. It was, you know, and there was some degree of Orientalism, as we know. But he is someone that I think really kind of defied that. And in the interwar period, I really was interested in American investment in Iran, the beginnings of American investment. I do look at that. I also grapple with themes of nation building in Iran, such as the army and the navy in particular, but also in sort of an incipient Air Force that is developing in this time period, or there's a desire to develop it. And I also talk about how in this moment, you know, policing aerial boundaries and frontiers becomes really significant. And then moving into, you know, so I do spend quite a lot of time trying to kind of document how America began to engage more deeply with Iran on multiple levels. So through economics, through diplomacy, but also, and I think most significantly in the interwar period, through culture and education, which we see a lot of in this time period. And also history, like this fascination with the history, the ancient history of Iran, with Ferdowsi, with, you know, all of the things that at that time the state associated with Iranianness, you know, and the involvement of Orientalists, not only Americans but also Russians and others in the mid 1930s in particular, and of course the University of Pennsylvania, where I am, we had many exchanges and archaeological digs that also originated at the University of Pennsylvania. So that's kind of the first part of the book. Things really begin to change with the Second World War. Probably one of my favorite chapters of the book is the Second World War. To be honest with you, I had to cut this chapter in half because it was originally 100 pages. And I'm glad I did in a way. The other half appeared in another book that was also just published in a co-edited volume between Robert Steele and me on decolonization in Iran. But that chapter has all the nice pictures. So all the great, cartoons and so forth are there. The chapter here is more political, and also kind of tries to document the suffering of Iranians in the Second World War. This is a theme that's also very important to me personally. My family is from the north of Iran. My grandparents remember the Russian occupation of, or remembered, they're not here anymore, sadly. They remembered the Russian occupation of Iran. My uncle, to whom I dedicate this book, he also remembers. I've done many oral histories with him that one day I hope to publish. But he was like around 7 years old. And he remembers the rations, the sugar rations in this time period. And my mother was born in the Second World War as well. And I also point out that it's because of this background too that, the involvement of Russia is always so central in our sort of psyche, I guess, because anytime we would go and we would spend most of our vacations up north, you could see these Russian boats were always stationed with, like Cyrillic and whatever. So it was kind of a part of the landscape in a weird way, But the Second World War, I think, has been understudied in Iran. I know that in Iran itself, there was like a symposium on it a few years back. But there hasn't been good analytical work, I think. This is a huge topic. And one of the things that I argue is that the history of the Second World War, Iran's involvement in it, shouldn't just be taught in histories of Iran and courses that are on the history of Iran or the Middle East, but also in European history classes, because people really don't know much about it. And I think in Winston Churchill's book, he says this was but an episode, right? For Iranians, it wasn't but an episode. It was really something deeply traumatic. And many of the people, there were these camps, internment camps that were set up when the British invaded. Many of the individuals who end up going on to lead the country after the Second World War actually experienced that kind of momentary incarceration in this time period. And that's written about actually recently very eloquently by my colleague, Dr. Pardis Minucher. And so in that same volume that I mentioned. So there's a lot here that hasn't been unpacked enough. And I think it's important to sort of emphasize what it was like for Iran to be a country under occupation. The cover of the book actually comes from that. This is a moment when it's in 1943. This is the wife of the American minister, Mrs. Dreyfus. And by the way, Louis Dreyfus, I never know how to pronounce it, and Mrs. Dreyfus were very beloved, actually, even when they left. Some of the smaller publications would write about them when they were in a car accident. One of the little journals actually kind of wrote about it and, sympathetically. But here in this picture, you sort of see, so she's here touring the very poor sections of Iran. And there are many others that I could have chosen. I chose this one because I feel like it just spoke to me so deeply. I don't know the names of any of these individuals except for Mrs. Dreyfus, right? But you can kind of see the themes, poverty, one of the issues that I talk about, not here, but in the other article, is how children didn't have enough clothes, so it wasn't just that there wasn't enough food, but here you can really see that. You can see that, society was suffering in a way that I don't think has been documented enough in terms of Iran's experiences. And the other thing too, of course, is there were a lot of things happening. We had, sort of nationalist or from the Iranian state perspective, separatist movements in Azerbaijan. And, there were the family of Sheikh Khazal, his sons were trying to kind of reclaim land in Khuzestan. And also Kurdistan. So, there were a lot of things happening. Of course, there was also the Soviet occupation of the North, the involvement of the Soviet Union in some of these fracas, I guess. And so I think that again, it was really important for me to try to pull it together. But then we also have a very important strike in Abadan, like the oil strike of 1946. And I was able to find some really interesting material that documented some of the sectarian conflict among the Arab and Iranian oil workers in this time period, which I thought was really interesting as well. I learned a lot from it myself personally. And so eventually, of course, Iran's case is sent to the UN. The Soviets do leave, and there's a new chapter in Iran. So in this new chapter, a lot of things happen. The Shah of Iran in 1949 goes on his first trip to the United States. Just recently, I talked about this in an interview in Persian. In the same year that the Shah first visits the United States, Sayyid Qutb, who was, the dissident writer from Egypt, at that time a very young man, and of course the war had just happened between Israel, the newly founded state of Israel, in 1948. The war was concluded in 1949, but Qutb had been sent by the Egyptian state to learn about the educational missions in the United States. He left, I think, the end of 1948. So the most formative time for him was actually 1949. So basically the same year the Shah was in the United States. And so I juxtaposed these two images and these two sort of perspectives on the United States in this time period. So when you look at these commemorative editions of the Shah's trip in 1949, of course, they were very celebratory. They were, just all very positive. The Shah meeting, all the important people and going to universities, factories, whatever. Very different from the account that Sayyid Qutb writes and then is subsequently published in 1951 as The America I've Seen, which really describes this sort of profligate society. He's kind of turned off, essentially. But it has also been argued that as an Arab, as an African Arab, North African Arab, in this moment, he also experienced a lot of racism, coming here. And so it was a particularly difficult juncture for him. We don't really get any of that in those. Of course, the Shah's accounts were all commemorative. They served a different purpose. But I still think that juxtaposition is very interesting. The Shah returns to Iran, and then he confronts a country in turmoil. And we know a lot of the history that comes after that. There is violence, there are assassination attempts and assassinations. And then that kind of bleeds into the oil nationalization crisis, which we know of. And in my book, although I do talk about it, it is really, I don't give it the kind of the pride of place that you see in other books, precisely because so often that is the formative, that's the moment, right? And I think that it is, but I also argue that in many ways, the Second World War was also that moment. And we need to kind of move back a little bit in time to understand 51, 53 through an earlier lens, an earlier timeline. And then after, of course, this has been argued by just about every Iranian historian, which is this is the second phase of the Shah's rule. It's more sort of dictatorial. The period of political openness between 1941 and 53, which resulted in the efflorescence of many political parties, comes to an end. And again, it's been argued most recently in a new book by David Painter and Gregory Brew that that this was really kind of a tragedy on so many levels, not only for Iran-US relations, but also for the Shah, and of course, most importantly, for the people of Iran. And it's something that really kind of changed how things might have been. I still believe, So moving into the 1960s, the issue that I think was most significant to me, also being a part of a department that is very strong in American history. Also, as someone who went to college in the American South, I went to UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina in the 1980s as an Iranian who really hadn't been in the United States for very long. So that was certainly a cultural awakening of sorts. But also dealing with the issue of race and racism in the United States and how Iran kind of came to terms with that, including the Shah himself. So chapters that follow, I kind of try to track two parallel discourses, sort of like dissident discourse on the subject, as well as state discourses on the subject. And I have to say, it was probably one of my favorite parts of the book to write. It was also very eye-opening to me because really, you know, the journals that I've looked at, even Italat and Kayhan in this time period, were literally untouched. And one of my favorite moments was finding, as I say in almost every talk, was finding this on when Malcolm X was killed. Both Kayhan and Italat, they have this cover story that calls him Malcolm Dahon instead of Malcolm X, because, you know, they didn't know. But interestingly, the Islam, I know, but the Islamist journals of that time period actually got it right. And so that was another thing that I learned in writing this book, was that how many smaller circulation Islamist journals existed in that time period, and how the theme of racism was being tied with sort of broader issues of social justice in Iran. I mean, in Islam. I do think there was an essentializing element in this. I do think there was certainly an attempt to kind of gloss over you know, divisions within the Islamic world as well, and, you know, Islamic world's own sort of history of racism as well. But again, I was surprised that there was such a knowledge of race relations in the United States in a way that the periodical press came to a little bit later. And simultaneously, you know, the Shah also, you know, expands relations with many countries of the global South, particularly in Africa, and has a very complicated relationship with South Africa in particular, because of, you know, the apartheid state, but also the fact that his father ends up dying there. And so there's this kind of weird relationship, the sensitivity, this acknowledgement that the state in no way, shape, or form wants to be associated with supporting apartheid or having over, you know, any kind of political relations with South Africa. But at the same time, they do, you know, maintain some economic ties. The other thing that was really interesting to me was a name that may be familiar to some of you is historian Feridun Adamiyat. He was on a commission actually in the UN on questions of apartheid and race. And this was, and so he, you know, so I was so excited to find this because I only ever knew him through his other works, like on the constitutional period or his work on Bahrain Islands or whatever. And I didn't realize that there was this chapter in his life, which was so fascinating to me, where he served on, you know, in the UN, and he dealt with questions of racism, particularly regarding South Asians in South Africa, you know. And so again, that was like an interesting thing for me. And then I sort of go into the more sort of the historiography of also the years before the revolution. I'm of the opinion that, you know, a lot of this history has been written by some of the extremes of opinion in Iran's political culture. And, you know, so what I tried to do was not to just listen to the extreme voices, but to try to find voices that I thought were different, maybe more measured or reason, and why. And one of the people I focus on a lot is Mohammad Ali Islami Nodushan. I really was so amazed to find so many essays that he'd written. Also the fact that his books, although there's tons of material written on him, they have not really been studied for historical purposes, you know, and kind of, or sufficiently. I really don't think some of them were even have really been looked at, to be honest. But so I thought that was a really kind of interesting thing, because when you look at this period, the people you often hear about are, you know, Shariati and Al Ahmad. But, you know, you look at, and, you know, Nudushan also had spent time at Harvard in that the seminar that Kissinger had organized. And so it's interesting to kind of do this. And how much more time do I have? Okay, great. So okay, so I'll wrap it up. Yeah, so I was kind of trying to document this very, I think, contested history in this particular way. And it was also very, again, it was hard to write it because I don't think any of us is neutral about it if you were in Iran or you experienced it or your family was affected by it, and that's certainly true for me as well. But I think it's also important to try to remove yourself from the equation to the best that we can, and kind of try to understand the complexity of what was going on at the same time. I end, since we're looking for an ending, I think, on what I hope is a more positive note. I look at this history as one in which it was most successful when it was a relationship that was not based on the sort of like this sort of imperial model, but one that recognized mutual one that recognized sort of mutual interests, but also one that was able to realize many kind of important and positive moments through culture and social relations. I end with this earthquake in Iran, actually in 1968. There's this picture of a little boy, and he looks so sad. You feel the tragedy of this terrible event in 1968, this terrible earthquake that was so destructive. And he's surrounded with all this rubble. If he were alive, he would actually be older than I am right now. But when I saw that picture, I was so moved by it. I don't know his name. I know nothing about him. But I sort of thought, this is in a moment of tragedy. You had the Peace Corps come in, and the Peace Corps wrote so many things about like volunteers. There's a website where they've documented how many of them went in there and they helped in this moment. American tents were sent, and so it's like a weird moment, where sure, America also was involved in Vietnam. Iranian intellectuals, in particularly, were not happy about that. And there were so many questions about the Shah standing with the United States in the Cold War. But for me, ending on that note, where this devastating event has just happened, and you have these people who are American, who are Iranian, who are more traditional Islamists, who are not, just kind of rallying around people who need to survive, right? And so I think that those were the stories that unfortunately have gotten lost, that I hope I was able to bring to the fore. Thank you so much.
Sure. So I'll share my screen here. And let me see if I can do this the right way so everyone can see it. Make this a slideshow. Yeah, I'm moving it around. Let's see. Unshare and reshare. Okay. Stop share. And then share again. Right. Can everyone see it?
Yeah, is there a way to make the slideshow?
Let's see. I'll just do it like this, and I'll scroll through it. Yeah, you can help. This.
This thing you are gonna hit.
Yeah, I can't see it on mine for some reason. Oh, there we go. Which one is it? There. All right, good, perfect. Okay, so I have a few questions. First, thank you to Professors Keshavarsian and Mirsapasi for organizing this and for inviting me. And of course, it's an honor to be here with you. You know, it's really hard to think about personal stories and fraught histories in political terms, right? Moving from the personal and then jumping scales to the sociocultural, and then to the political. And it's a brave thing for a social and a cultural historian to try to write political and diplomatic history. And so the questions I have sort of move in between those types of history, and I wanted to do them through a few different images that pick up on some key points that you've talked about in the 1920s, with apologies for moving oil back to the center to the 1950s, and then in the 1970s. And what I'd like to do here is pick up on something that you said when you were talking about Iran and its reaction to the growing military relationship between the United States and Israel in the 1950s and 1960s, about Persian popular culture and how it reflects growing suspicions with the United States. And so I pulled three images here. One of them I've just talked with you about before we started the panel, so I won't spend very much time on it at all. But you have here something from 1924, when you have a U.S. financial mission led by Dr. Arthur Millspaugh in Iran, of course, who comes back during World War II, and who, as you write in your book, whose son actually causes quite a bit of problems in international relations because he's not really following cultural standards. Yeah, he's not behaving at all. But we have here sort of one of the failures of that financial mission in this Uncle Sam doppelganger that's walking off the screen behind the embodiment of Iran here, and saying, "I did not succeed." And this was to gain an oil concession in the north that was solely American, that was supposed to represent independence from APOC and from the British Empire. But of course, there's some ambiguity here, because you have another Uncle Sam figure sitting at a table of imperialists and international corporations. That sort of ambiguity isn't evident in this picture from your book, from a protest, right, where you have an Iranian worker fighting against an Uncle Sam character as John Bull is sort of tumbling into the nether regions. Right, so I thought that that presented an interesting contrast, and sort of, I don't know how you'd respond to this, perhaps a change over time, maybe a loss of idealism about the United States. You mentioned sort of the canonization of George Washington in the 19th century, and the idea of growth there. So I was wondering how you felt that worked in political culture. The third image I think was also interesting. There was a lot of comment. You didn't talk about this in your presentation, so I'm glad we can pick up on it some. There's a lot of commentary in Iran about the United States and Vietnam. And that plays an interesting role, a story that I didn't know before this. And here we have a criticism with another Uncle Sam figure that actually looks more like Abraham Lincoln than Uncle Sam, interestingly. And you have this critique of the Rogers Plan in Vietnam, sort of the Nixon administration's plan for South Vietnam at the time. But I would argue that within it, you have a broader critique of American-style modernization and some of its failures. So I was wondering, how that works, and of course, gender plays an interesting role here. So those are some of the questions I had based on the images and your analysis of popular culture and how it fits in with sort of more traditional diplomatic history. So we've moved from the 20s to the 50s to the 70s. Now to shift gears, Irang mentioned that you've written a novel Martyrdom Street. I took some time to read. I haven't finished it yet. It's also on my reading list. And there are interesting sort of characters in this novel. It's three women, all of whom represent sort of different perspectives that you could argue are kind of generational in a way. And here we have Fatima, who's from an older generation, and at this moment, she's remembering these same women lived at the hairdressers, molding an image invented by the Americans. In the 60s, they grew their hair long. In the 70s, they curled their hair. Although she never forgave me for telling her so, the Farrah Fawcett look didn't suit Zale's mother, even after she dyed her hair blonde. Such superficialities never belonged to our culture, right? And I think the italicized our culture is actually from the original. They were imported values sold to us at discounted rates in return for cheap oil. Then soon after, we have the statement, we needed a revolution. We were becoming an immoral country. We were becoming little America. Now, Fatima's perspective is contrasted in that same chapter with Nazreen, who falls in love in a quote unquote, and here I'm tilting my hand a little bit, I guess we're both historians, so it's okay for me to say this, falls in love with Nicholas in a boring college history class on South Asia, taught by a Dr. Sanders, who, and I'm quoting you again here, spoils the mood with extraneous academic comments about US involvement in Afghanistan. So I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the relationship between these, very personal stories and, the geopolitical moments. When I teach 1979 in US foreign relations classes, right, you talk about the revolution, right? You talk about the Soviet invasion, and eventually you talk about the Carter Doctrine, right? The declaration of this entire area as a place of national security importance for the United States. Finally, my last question does have to do with something you alluded to, which is what is next. You do have this positive end to your book. You mentioned Baraya Shervin Hajipour and the famous Grammy-winning song from a couple of years ago, and then you have this sort of discussion of bad timing and missteps. This sort of hope for reconciliation and optimism. And I was wondering sort of where you see the possibilities for what you very eloquently and beautifully describe as simple gestures of humility between the two nations. Okay. So thank you.
I too am very thankful to have the opportunity to read your book and be in conversation. It's truly a very, as I already mentioned, a very rich narrative. Built, I want to emphasize for the audience who maybe not had a chance to delve into the book yet. It's really built from stitching together a massive and broad collection of sources. We're not just simply talking Persian and English and other languages, but we're talking about government documents from Iran, the US, Britain, and elsewhere, but also a really impressive and close reading of periodicals and newspapers. This is really a hallmark of Professor Kashani-Sabet's history writing. She really takes printed materials seriously and really pores over them. Cartoons of these scenes, editorials, and I've always appreciated that. But in this book, it really kind of jumps out. It's not just diplomatic histories and memoirs, but she actually grapples with the contemporary record and debates and dialogues taking place. So clearly there's a lot of intellectual labor that's gone into producing this volume, substantial, 375 pages or so, really pondering this fraught history between the US and Iran, but doing so through and with the help of 40 pages of bibliography, right? Over 40 pages, I should say. A bibliography that really uncovers what I think you just used the term loss or underappreciated or forgotten moments in this long history of U.S.-Iranian entanglements, moments, but also texts that have been kind of overlooked or misread, figures that have fallen through the cracks, and really, so it's very, for even those of us who, sorry, is this better? Okay, I'm sorry, I'll just use that. So for those of us who have read a fair amount of Iranian history, there's still so much to learn from this volume, and I encourage folks to spend time with this volume. So unlike most accounts of the US-Iran relations that tend to be almost exclusively focused on intergovernmental relations and grand strategies and planning, Professor Kashani-Sabet really leans into her own strengths, her own skill set, her own training as a cultural and social historian. And so she really tackles this question as a question of social and cultural relations and forces. So we, at various moments and kind of repeatedly and across this 200-year history, we learn about films, art exhibitions, missionaries, gender norms, diaries, travelers, both to the US and to Iran and elsewhere. It's a really layered history, I would describe it, of that kind of almost return to some of the same themes over, again, a couple centuries, over, I think, about 10, 12 chapters. So the author, I mean, the reader is invited to think about the continuities, but obviously the disjunctures and the ruptures of this tense, fraught history. Now, the other part that I want to underline, this is also, because it's a social and cultural history, this is a history that's not exclusively focused on Tehran or Washington, right? Time and again, we're taken to Urumiyeh, to Abadan, to all four corners of Iran, to Colorado, and to various places in the United States. So it's a US-Iranian history that is not about relations between capital cities or metropoles, right? So, and that's also, I would say, refreshing and important for Iranian studies writ large. Iranian studies unfortunately, has tended to be overly Tehran-centric. I say this as someone who has participated in that shenanigan by writing a book about the Tehran Bazaar, but I acknowledge that there is a limitation, and this is an attempt to push us out of Tehran, which is very much welcome. One aspect that I really liked about the volume, and again, this is kind of repeated throughout the book, is how Firoozeh, if you don't mind, I'm just going to call you Firoozeh, regularly uses US sources to describe episodes and events in Iran, and to juxtapose how American diplomats and travelers understood those events in Iran in relationship to how Iranians understood them themselves, right? And that was always kind of interesting. And conversely, she uses Iranian sources or Persian language sources to reflect on events in the United States. The example she gave here, Malcolm X and so on and so forth. So we're kind of, these sources are used to create a dialogue in a sense, right? And to emphasize the importance of perceptions, right? And that really carries through throughout the volume, and is really appreciated. So this is a book about perceptions, misperceptions, misunderstandings. It's a book about memories, maybe faulty memories in some cases, as much about geopolitical struggles and imperatives and interests and ideologies and so forth. This also results in presenting us with a picture of a non-unified and non-monolithic Iran, right? Different positions are taken on World War II, on the question of British colonial aspirations, and Iranians have different views on what modernity is, should be, and can be. On page 235, Professor Kashani-Sabet, Firoozeh, discusses the 1960s, and she writes, very matter-of-factly, quote, Persian society could not unite itself around much, right? And that, again, that for me was a theme across the book, continuously, just when you think there's going to be a unification of Iran, Firoozeh shows us how there's dissents, there's differences of opinion, there's struggles, and so forth. And I'll come back to this in a moment. Ultimately, this is a book it's a longue durée. It covers 2 centuries. It allows one to contemplate U.S.-Iran relations across distinct moments in the history of the political development of Iran, the U.S., and the Middle East. And ultimately, there's nothing inevitable or natural or doomed about this relationship. So one of the aspects of this longue durée is that she's able to emphasize the continuities, but none of it is inevitable. There are moments of alternative futures and possibilities that I really appreciated. There are many interesting chapters here. I definitely found the chapter on what is titled the anti-Aryan moments, delving into the question of race and racism in the let's say the post-World War II moment is really illuminating and seminal in many ways, groundbreaking. Not many scholars have thought about this in the ways that we see here. But let me also second Firoozeh's own comments and give a shout out to chapter 7 on World War II. It's titled From Culture Wars to a World War, which was for me a particularly compelling and rich chapter on a topic that I absolutely agree is oftentimes looked over and underappreciated both by academics and I would say actually many ordinary Iranians. I think it's interesting to think why. I think maybe in some sense the 1953 coup or Bistahashta Mordad is sort of overwritten World War II and Iranians just kind of jumped to 1953 without seeing the significance of World War II. And this chapter and I guess another chapter elsewhere really force us to grapple with this this rupture, transformation in Iranian society, as well as the transformation of Iran's place in the world. And I think that simultaneity is important. And I look forward to assigning it in courses and so forth. And Middle East studies, in a sense, I think there's been a real good revisiting of World War I, which is important. But I think World War II is kind of the next major war that we need to grapple with. I think in general, but World War II is kind of Middle East studies, it's not quite sure how to delve with it. And there's a rich kind of social history to be written. And this is a very important beginning. Let me speed up here. What I was going to do is just kind of touch on 3 themes that I think carried across the book, 3 themes that are social and cultural, and maybe ask Firoozeh if she would like to elaborate or think a little bit more about these. One is the question of education, which really in this book for me is kind of the connective tissue between the US and Iran. And maybe she could flesh this out in a more abstract way. Why is education so important for US-Iran relations? Second, something we haven't mentioned, but for me was really striking, is the role of religious minorities as both an object and a subject of US-Iran relations. And I'll say more about that in a second. And third, a sort of paradox that this book outlines for us, where we time and again see US officials acknowledging the diversity of Iranian society, but yet, unfortunately, actual policymakers in Washington treat Iran as a unitary actor. And I'll say more about that. And there seems to be an unresolved tension that the book identifies here. So on the question of education, I won't, actually in the presentation, we already heard a lot about this. This book has a lot to teach us about missionaries, educational reforms in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the kind of religious tensions that this triggered. We learn a lot about various waves of Iranians studying abroad, including family members of Firoozeh herself. We learn about, we have close examinations of the role of the University of Pennsylvania and various other institutions in Iran. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more. And for me, what was important about the discussion of education is that oftentimes when we talk about Iranian history, including the Iranian Revolution, the figure of the Roshan Fekh, the intellectual, is highlighted, right? And we were asked to think about intellectuals in Iran. By thinking about education, secondary, primary education, I think the door you're opening is this other figure, not the Roshan Fekh, but the Farhangi, right? And I've never known how to translate this into English really, but the school teacher, the small scale translator, the small publisher, those who think of themselves as Farhangi, not Bazari, not Dolati, not Roshan Fekh, but school teachers and so forth. And I, in a sense, reading between the lines, I'm wondering if that's what you're encouraging us, is to move our attention away from the elites, the Roshan Fekhs, these intellectual figures, and to actually grapple with this, the kind of the micro production of the middle class, the intelligentsia. On the religious minorities, and let's call them non-Shia Muslims, time and again, you really nicely pause and have us grapple with this. So for instance, you point out that in 1912, when Abdul Baha, the son of and successor of the Baha'u'llah, visited the United States, there were already 30,000 American converts to the Baha'i faith. I was really shocked about that, right? And there are many other examples I won't go into that you kind of show how the figure of the religious minority or religious minor individuals figure. And I just wonder if you want to pause and just share some thoughts about how what you kind of gleaned from that. Lastly, let me just end by, as I mentioned, what I gleaned from this book was that there is this real tension or even a paradox in that there are many US officials, lower officials in the embassy and the missionaries, this wonderful figure that you mentioned, Hornibrook, right? A fascinating figure, right? His analysis is brilliant in many ways. Time and again, these officials acknowledge that Iranian society is diverse, dynamic, there are different classes, different religions, different attitudes, different political persuasions. Yet, if I understood correctly, policymakers and US officials slip into a view that this multiplicity simply either doesn't exist or is unimportant. And all we need to focus on is the Shah, the Ayatollah, or this category of the Iranians. And now it's in vogue these days, the ordinary Iranians. Like that. I guess they're extraordinary Iranians and they're ordinary ones. But anyway, this huge, all of Iran could be captured by these monoliths, ordinary Iranians, the Shah, Ayatollah. And your work wants to push against that, right? And I'm wondering, how do you make sense of why many people warned against the simplified image of Iran, but yet that simplified image creeps in? And I'm just wondering, after writing this wonderful book, you have some thoughts about this tension and paradox. So I'll end on that. I'm cognizant that we have a lot of folks who probably have questions for you. Why don't we give you maybe 5 to 8 minutes? You obviously can't cover all of this, but whatever you want to touch on or elaborate, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Great. So thank you so much. There's so much here to digest for me. And again, I can't thank you enough, both of you, for your deep engagement with the subjects of the book and seeing things maybe a little differently from the way I had written them or had intended them. So that's always really fun to sort of encounter in conversations like this. I'll just do it in order. So I just want to begin. Thank you again for the points that you raised about, I do think oil is important, but in the 1920s, remember, the United States had a very tenuous place in terms of the oil diplomacy of the Middle East. And so going into, so not just in Iran, but also in Kuwait, and eventually in Bahrain, and of course, Saudi Arabia. So I think that there's a bigger picture when you look at the United States in the 1920s that is not just Iran, but it's really the region. And how, there's some, in another article I wrote, I was just so fascinated by this British image of, this American image of, or criticism of Britain just elbowing out the Americans, from the oil market. Like, we just don't want you there. And so Americans are, they have a good relationship diplomatically with Britain, but they're trying to navigate this, tension that, in which, Britain just wants to control all the oil itself. So I think part of what you see in, with the Sinclair oil issue is really that, is America not having been very successful in kind of breaking through this market at that particular juncture. on the Mossadegh stuff. So I can't remember quite what you yeah.
Yeah, it was very similar. What is how does the image of the United States change over that time as it becomes more powerful, and the United States actually, works with the British. The U.S. government works to undermine Sinclair to support Standard Oil's, uh, you know, I guess alliance with APOC. Right, so they're working on behalf of one company, one more powerful company that's aligned with the British against another company. So there's kind of a division there that is erased, I think, over time. And so the question is there, how does that image change?
So it's funny. The original cover for the book was this really amazing satirical cartoon that I found in Persian, which showed, John Bull kind of being dragged around in chains by the United States. I really wanted to use that. I think, Dr. Mirsafasi, that was the original cover that I'd done, but everyone's like, oh, it like makes the West look very negative and the relationship very sort of kind of confrontational and so forth. I still love it. I wish I had been able to put it in the book. I reference it, but I don't think the pictures are. So I think that those cartoons and the fact that you have this wonderful picture of Yankee go home, in Persian, and it's being referenced by the point four officers in Iran at the time, I think it was a wonderful way of kind of cross-referencing what was being said in some of those point four memoirs. And then you find this Persian sort of rendition of it as well. So there's definitely a shift. But Mossadegh, initially in 51, I think was more optimistic about the United States. It really changes after that, and you get that. And in fact, he was invoking the Atlantic Charter, and things like that, which I thought was really fascinating. That, and he talked about the bridge of victory, Iran in the Second World War, when he was in the United States. So I do think that there was a desire to find in the United States, an ear, but as we know, things didn't work out that way. I have to say, and on the issue of Vietnam and the Rogers Plan, I mean, I found so many things on, this. I always talk about a Tawfiq. I love this journal because it is so brilliant. Like if you understand Persian, the wordplay that they have, they would say Nixon, Chikson, just I mean, that's the most ridiculous one, but I mean, literally everything. It's just so clever, and they really, there were so many images that coupled American money with actually failure in Vietnam. With Israel, it was different. It was, sort of like this kind of big, powerful figure, often exemplified by Nixon. But after 1967, I say this in another talk, it was also Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan appeared in so many pictures. And this is the funny part, is that they patched the wrong eye. They patched the right eye instead of the left eye of Moshe Dayan in all of these cartoons, or not, I don't know all, but many of them, so I don't really know why, but that was something that I noticed. So I do think that the coupling of these crises, all of them, are significant and speak to, I mean, there's a reason why I call the chapter Anti-Aryan Moment, because it speaks to a moment. It's not just one event. It's sort of like, a constellation of events. And then I think it's so funny that you found those passages in the novel. I wrote that novel when I was very young. I was in my 20s. And it was sort of like a cathartic experience, because I feel like I carried so much trauma from everything that happened because I was very young and whatever. I'm not going to get into my whole life story, but it was a way for me to kind of write, or I always say, fiction gives you the opportunity to talk about the emotions in a way that academic writing doesn't. So I could sort of work through my emotions by writing that. But as you were reading it, I was like, oh my God, I was so cynical about so many things. And actually I had forgotten, like not too long ago, I went back and I read it. There's so many details there about things that I remembered for the first decade after I left Iran. I'm so glad I wrote it in those years, because I would not have remembered it today, so thank you for that. And Arang, for the 3 points that you raise, what was the first one again?
Education.
Oh, education, right. Yeah. So I do think, and thank you for that, sort of the layered way in which education kind of creeps in. I mean, one of the things I also say is that there's been a lot of work, as you know, on Iranian students in the leftist movement and so forth. And while I do, really value that, I think that this is still at the beginning stages of this engagement, because I think there are a lot of students that we don't know about, people who were not activists in the movement, and who, didn't write about it necessarily. And, so I think that there's a lot there too. But also how the educational system in Iran changes. So, for example, in the 1968 Human Rights Conference, the first UN Human Rights Conference was held in Iran in Tehran in 1968. So, one of the things that the memoranda, Iranian memoranda, was saying was that, well, we should start teaching, about human rights in our in our curriculum. And I said in another talk, I seriously don't ever remember any of my, my sort of social studies classes talking about that at all. But I thought it was sort of interesting that there was this aspirational thing. So I think you're totally right that there is something there about, the sort of the unnamed, more literate class that is developing in this time period, that is not necessarily ideological, but that is still very much shaping Iranian society at this time. And then on the issue of minorities were always important. I mean, going back to the first encounters with the missionaries, it was always written about. But I still think that it was quite remarkable in Qajar period that although there were a couple of really well-known episodes of violence and kind of violence, by and large, it was not a terrible encounter, in the Qajar period. Like, you had the first group of missionaries coming. They actually invited, like, Perkins says, we invited whatever the religious classes to a wedding or something like that. And, I mean, maybe it is a little bit rosy or whatever, but again, I would have expected more instances of violence and clashes. The fact that they weren't as many as one might have expected, I think would seem to bode well. But that doesn't mean, I always say that particularly in the First World War, it was a really, really trying time for minority communities, especially in Urumia. But what was fascinating there too is, like, I went to the Rockefeller Archive Center. They have some documents there also, and there was the missionaries were also, they weren't just writing about the plight of Christians, right? They were also pointing out that Muslims, I don't remember if Jews were also mentioned, but I do remember, Muslims being mentioned as well. So I thought that was really very interesting too, the way that was documented. Yeah. And then the last one was,
it was just this U.S. officials emphasizing the diversity and the homogeneity of Iranians, while U.S. policy seems to be continuously talking about the Shah, the Ayatollah, as a monolith.
Yeah, so I think that really depends on perspective. I think if you read foreign policy memoranda and documents, that's the perspective you get, which is why I think it's really, really important not to just read that and not to tell the story simply from those, state to state exchanges, because you just really miss what's happening. You miss the fact that, for example, there were these two, I don't know how I found this in some obscure little journal, these two chefs who come in New York, and they start doing cholo kebab or something. Of course, I would remember the cholo kebab, but just stuff like that, like little details that you never expect. And so I just feel that this history has to continue to be told through this layered way of using different sources and materials. Thank you.
Thank you. We have I think we have about 30 minutes for questions and comments. I'm mindful that we have a good number of people on Zoom. for those of you on Zoom, you can write your questions or in the chat, chat section, and we'll kind of keep an eye on that, and we'll turn to those in due course. But let me open the floor first to those of you who are here in person. I think there will be a microphone circulating, so if you want to raise your hand, they'll give you a mic and you can share your thoughts.
Hi, Firoozeh. I've had this question for a while, and it hasn't come up in our prior conversations. But I'm glad that the issue of minorities came up, the fact that it's a non-monolithic society came up, because that's all part of what I wanted to ask. But it seems to me that at the core of Persian identity is that sense of being wronged and misunderstood, which we also talked about. And I think it underlies a lot of the misunderstandings and a lot of the issues that persist. So is the solution, because we're dealing with two very proud nations, and as much as we like to think of humility being possible between us, it's going to be tough. And having witnessed, especially how the Armenian minority is in a state of limbo there, I'm assuming that's the case with a lot of the other minorities. Is the solution to successful US policy playing the long game, where we approach all these different minorities and work with them sort of in conjunction with the official policy, foreign policy, or is there another solution to this sort of stalemate that we have at present? Because things are not looking good. And if anything, they're looking worse given the state of the Middle East conflict we see on the news every day. So what do you think is the solution? How do we get over this challenge?
Yeah, thanks, Victor. I mean, I used to always really pride, I grew up in Iran where I think one of the things I loved about my upbringing is that I was in a very multicultural society, and it was done organically. I mean, there was no social engineering that I could specifically point to. And I really love that. I always say, in my first grade class, we had people from all over, including Japanese. That's how I learned how to count to 1 to 10 in Japanese, because our teacher made us learn all the how to count from 1 to 10 in every language represented. And so I think that for me, that's been one of the sad stories of 1979, is that what I saw as kind of the organic multiculturalism of Iran sort of began to wane. And I think it is complicated. I mean, one of the things that the Islamic Republic has tried to do is to sort of kind of connect the politics of minorities in Iran with Western imperialism, for example. And it's very clever. And certainly there was that. We know, for example, even the missionaries, because there wasn't an embassy at first, so they sometimes did kind of function in that capacity. But I do think there's something that's been lost, and I think that the ideological stance of the country makes it really hard to engage openly with different narratives. So I think, my hope really is that, if you have a more open political culture, some of this will happen, again, more organically, so that, you have the space for minorities to, without the fear of execution or incarceration or whatever, or fear. I'm not saying it's always necessarily this way, but it's happened enough to make it a serious concern, right? And so I think that, a more open political culture and a more tolerant one. It's not just that it has to be open, it has to be tolerant, but I think tolerance also needs to be taught. I'm not sure how much of that is always being taught, and how much of that is being welcomed necessarily anywhere, not only in the Islamic Republic, but really in a lot of communities. So I think that those are some essential steps. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating, and I'm sorry that I haven't had the chance to read the book, but I really look forward to doing that. One of the things that really stuck with me is the emphasis both you had, and in his comments Arang had, that to understand, to have a complicated history of Iran and United States, you really cannot just rely on state documents. It is much more than it is much more complicated. And in terms of how these two countries interacted with each other on the ground. And my question is about after 1979, when things get even more complicated, these two countries don't have official relationships anymore. If you still want to see how these two, not the states, but if you want to call it cultures, two regions, two locations, what are ways to actually see that the populations, the cultures, the ideas are still interacting with each other, even though the travel is not as easy anymore. But I am still fascinated by the fact that on average, Iranians' English is much better than, let's say, the next door Turkey. So they still have a better chance, an increased chance of following what's going on, even at a place where the diplomatic relationship is not there anymore, right? The way that it was pre-1979. So how can one actually see that beyond the state type of relationship building or contact and communication?
Thank you so much. That's such an interesting question that I really hadn't thought about. But I do think that, some of it, I think, is just general rebellion and rebellious attitude. It's sort of like the way a lot of the leftists were during the period of the Shah. Whatever is forbidden, you kind of, it's like the forbidden fruit, you're more attracted to it. And I think part of the fascination with America and the West in general, I think probably is because there's such a negative stance on the part of the state. So it's viewed as a form of sort of rebellion, also just, yeah. But I do think that, this history obviously has been ingrained more than we realize. So that even after, the sort of this caesura, this moment where, suddenly there is a big break on the political level, it doesn't really go away on a cultural level. The other thing too is, I learned a lot in the past few years. I'm so naive, really, in a lot of ways. And so I think that there are stealth networks that I don't know about, like in diplomacy. I think diplomacy is happening. I just am not sure how it's happening because I'm not in the know, but it always fascinates me that there is diplomacy, and what that means and what that looks like. I have really no idea. But I wish I did, because I think it would be better if there were more openness and an open invitation to enable it, Yeah, thank you.
Kian, should we? Yeah, we'll Kian will take one by one. So Kian, and then
yeah, just two very quick questions. One is, what would you say are the main misunderstandings between the two cultures that you found? And the second question is about 1953 and the coup. And I wonder about writing historiography. One, assuming you see 1953 as a pivotal moment for the Iranians, how, in writing history of other nations that have had pivotal moments, one thinks of the atom bomb in Japan or something like that, did you look at the way in which the other nations have, is there a historiography about pivotal moments? I'm just curious. It's like how it evolves over time. People get over it, so to speak, to use a colloquial term. France and Germany have seemed to have got over, a really horrific period. And yet for Iran, it always seems this idée fixe, it's like never goes away. So I was just curious how you grappled with that, and I'd be very interested in what you found about what you think are the main misunderstandings about the two.
Thank you so much. So the main misunderstandings, I think, have to do with one, that everything had to do with America's support for the Shah. I think it's a lot more complicated than that, and I think America's position in the Cold War in many ways wasn't helping it. And that's something I tried to show in the book, was how popular culture, because of course there was censorship in Iran, but when you begin to write about these world events, right, I think that really shaped public opinion. So I think one is, again, looking at other kind of, looking at other sort of trends in this history is very important. One is that I think gender is a really big one that is very understudied. One of the things I argue in the book is that just as the United States had a sexual revolution, Iran also had a sexual revolution, or was trying to have one, and there was such a tug of war. This Kulturkampf, was simply unresolved, and it remains unresolved in Iran. And so I think that we shouldn't be shocked that over the last 100 years or so, that remains one of the pivotal issues that we talk about. On the matter of, and the coup is important, but I'm kind of a stubborn historian. So if everyone keeps telling me this is what matters more than anything else, there's a part of me that is like, well, really, this is what matters. I do think there are a couple of other things that should have been important. One is, of course, social equality, and finding better ways of creating a more sort of equitable, economically equitable society in Iran. But the other thing too is, like I said, this is a reason why I emphasize the Second World War in some ways more than the 1953 coup, because I think that there's a misunderstanding of how the Second World War really informs what happens after, particularly, as I said, the experience of incarceration of some of the elite of Iran in that time period. On the issue of pivotal moments, I don't know about the historiography of this. When you're, this is something I grappled with. A book that is where everyone has an opinion about it on a subject. Like if you're writing a book where everyone has an opinion about it, such as Iran and America, I think you can't avoid pivotal moments, or what people have come to understand as pivotal moments. But again, I think our job as scholars and historians is really to find stories that people don't know about, and sort of to encourage the reader to sort of rethink those pivotal moments. Maybe they're always going to be pivotal, but to look at them through a different lens. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe a quick response to your question, Kian. I actually don't make a big distinction between World War II and the coup. It's just the end of what was happening. But there is a way you can see the 79 revolution as the revenge of the 53 coup generation, who became prime minister, Bazargan. If you look at the ministers, the cabinet, these were all young political activists, pro-Mossadegh, who remained both political and anti-American, and for them, the 53 coup was the main issue. So my suggestion, at least, is that the 53 is not the main political issue as far as U.S.-Iran relations is concerned. And for instance, in the past few years, the role that U.S. is playing, and the way that Iran is communicating with U.S. shows that at least somehow they are past 53 coup. The issue now is Israel, and not 53 coup, and it's more complicated. Thank you so much, Firoozeh Jan. just following up on what you said about, I don't want to say this book is a counter narrative, a different narrative about US and Iran relationship, and follow up on many of very, very interesting, Aranjan, your both reading of the text and question you posed. Both of you remind me of other writings that are not, or other kind of cultural relationship that it's not that they are not known, but we don't often talk to them about them, even when it comes to very prominent intellectuals. For instance, you mentioned Dr. Nadushani. Al Ahmad visited US, both Harvard and DC. I felt his memoir of his trip to US was actually very interesting, and I've tried to see if anybody wrote about it or debated Al Ahmad, or there was, it was published, of course, in Iran, but no, I haven't found anything. But it is interesting to know that Al Ahmad writes, and the way he writes is not anything similar to many of his other writings. And also, even among the left, say left intellectuals who were very anti-American, perhaps because of 53 or because of the Cold War, perhaps one single person who did more than anyone else or any other institutions in Iran in introducing American literature through translation to Iranians was Najaf Daryabandari, who was a leftist and politically anti-American, but in a very thoughtful way, he began for 3 decades translating major works of modern American literature, and we all learn through that. And my last, my last comment is just of my memory that when I was in middle school, all I would read were American detective stories. I would ask my dad, who always was worried about my education. I understand your comment about, although I was really, really good, but he was always worried. I was, so what have you read? And I said, well, I'm reading American detective stories. He said, you don't learn anything. I said, no, I can tell you every street in New York City and in San Francisco. For some reason, all the books I read happened either in New York. After revolution, when I came to US, we landed in New York. That was the image I had. And New York City, by the way, was more, there was more light, it was, and more lively than those pictures. I think it's important writing about them. And this was, I was in a very small town. This story, this is the time that I was in middle school, and I could not afford buying books. I would rent the books for 2 days. We had, you know, because books were expensive, and there was no American missionaries or American anything in there. These books were translated, and everybody would read it. By the way, I would read anything available, but what I want to say is that it is important that this is what it was available to us. And even at that time, I was not a fan of American foreign policy or America in terms of its role in the world. Thank you so much on this. And also, I want to sort of compliment or follow up on your question is that even at the elite level, the attitude toward US was more complex than usually the way they are present. Thank you.
I just wanted to say something about the Franklin Books program, which you've referenced. I think that was one, but it was also very limited in a lot of ways. So I do think that there were other translation venues, ways in which America was being introduced, including through, Al Ahmad, which, by the way, his Safarname Amrika was published later. It was actually published as excerpts in سالنامه جهان نو, I think, or I think it was جهان نو, yeah. No, اولش یه چیز دیگه داشت, ولی and then it becomes جهان نو. And so I first saw the translations in that, but it wasn't just, I mean, I think one of the things I love about that journal actually is you see so many different translations. So I do think American translations have to be read alongside Francophone translations in this time period. And, I agree with you. And I think the role of novels is very significant. But also how, in his short story, Shohar Amrikai, right? He's also very cynical, right? I mean, it's such a diabolical story, actually, when you think about it. I mean, I think there's so many different ways in which American culture was being communicated to Iranians in this time period. But I also think, like, in a lot of rural communities, like, it wasn't as big. I mean, I remember my cousin, for example, in Rasht, he had just discovered Hemingway, but in Persian, they connected his name. So he was telling us he was so excited about this book called Hemingway, because and so, but he, and so I wondered, I've always remembered that, because I thought, what is it that you're getting from, this culture when you're reading it with such a different lens, and how that's being communicated to you, and why does it still resonate with you so much, right? I think it's, of course, the strength of the literature, no doubt, but also the strength of the translation, which I haven't really looked at, so I can't really speak to that. But the point I'm trying to make, I think, is that there were so many different layers. Franklin Books program was one of them for sure. I don't think it was the only one, though.
We have a couple more minutes. I think there's one question in the chat. So why don't we, if you don't mind, Amanda, would you kindly read that out? And if there are last questions, we can take it from the floor as well.
Sure. So we have, thank you for this wonderful presentation. The Iran 1400 Project is grateful to have been a co-sponsor. Many people perceive a significant rupture in the US-Iran relations following the Islamic Revolution. In contrast, what continuities did you notice in their relationship over the past century or so?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And I think, again, a lot of the continuities can be found over this similarity of certain ideals. Like, I think there are a lot of shared progressive values, if you think about it. And that's something that a lot of people have tried to point out. But I also don't think that progressive values were exclusively the bailiwick of the Iranian left, for example, before the revolution. And so by the same token, I think that these sort of progressive values have endured in many ways. So I think that's one of the continuities that we see. I think the fascination with the United States, the sort of love-hate relationship, what is Iran's, Iran's kind of positionality vis-a-vis the United States, that discourse has continued, but through a different lens and a different perspective. I think that's certainly been a part of it. And also, this is one of the points I make in the book. Understanding Iran's own self-perception in this relationship is very significant. The fact that Iran has this self, I mean, we are essentializing, but what the heck, the sense that, Iran too has this long history, and, Iran may not be as powerful as the United States, but heck, you're gonna, you're going to take note. We're here. We're going to make you notice us, type of thing. And I think that those are some of the ways in which Iranian identity politics, Iranian nationalism even, have persisted in this time period. Thank you.
We have time for two short questions. When we have Larry, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Kevin. So Larry and Kevin, and we'll give Firoozeh the last word.
Oh, thank you, Firoozeh, for really fascinating talk, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I'm glad you highlighted the World War II period, because this is a period, you know, and when I'm covering it, practically all the writing, you know, is about the war, you know, is about the Soviet policy, American policy. You know, what about the Iranians? And I think it's interesting when you look back at that whole period from 1941 down to 53, when you don't have, you know, the iron hand of a Shah, you know, leaning on the Iranian people, and making the Mossadegh, you know, event even more poignant, because many Iranians, you know, felt that they were cheated out of, you know, developing a society on their own without having, you know, the experiment cut short. And I'm just kind of, you know, curious about when you looked at that period, you know, that decade or whatever, what kind of trends did the Iranian people kind of reveal, you know, that you know, were reflected, you know, their values, or when they had the freedom to do what they wanted. You had an explosion of newspapers, you had an explosion of political parties, you had an explosion of politics, and, you know, the apogee of the two-day. But I'm just interested, you know, what was kind of revealed about the Iranian people during this period when they didn't have the heavy hand of the government over them, and how, you know, this affected subsequent events.
So yeah, thank you.
Sorry, can we just give Kevin also the question?
Hi, good evening. Oh my gosh. Sorry about that. First off, thank you so much for NYU for hosting this event and for writing this book. Just real quick, with current events and specifically everything that's taking place in Gaza right now, over the last 6 months, in light of that, I've noticed in the West, particularly in the US, on social media platforms like, say, TikTok, I don't know, and other ones, there's been, I'll just use an example. Just last night, I was browsing YouTube, and there's this video of Saddam Hussein, it was filmed in the 80s, I imagine, and he's talking about, it's a propaganda video meant for Iraqi citizens at the time, about how to confront the Zionist aggressor. And now things like that, or bin Laden's manifesto, I think it was, received a lot of attention on these platforms, and I'm just waiting for Khomeini or recordings from his cassettes to show up. And I was wondering, with this inflection point that we're experiencing right now, with this heightened awareness of what's going on in the Middle East, which I think is incredibly important, among other things. How do you see this dissemination of disinformation affecting things?
So thank you. Yeah, I'm going to begin with Larry's question about how this period, what we were seeing about this period of relative openness. And I think it depends, like if you're looking from 41 to 46, there was some openness, but let's not forget that Britain had imposed censorship on the Iranian press and what was being done, like the Allies, not just Britain, and the Russians were doing it also, and the British were, and the Americans were doing it. There were a lot of propaganda films actually, and it was weird because there was one moment where I think they were showing pictures of people in a war. I think it was an American movie of some war, I don't really remember. And they're like, well, people aren't really interested. They're in the midst of a war themselves, like they don't want to go watch a movie that's about a war. I thought that was very funny. Telling, not so much funny. But I think that episode is really very significant. I think the Majlis is so rich, when you look at the after 46 in particular, the debates in the Majlis, the fact that, as you say, there are many political parties and there's a lot of extreme of opinion in that time period. One of the things that I leave with, which I think you also reference in my take on it, is that you really do begin to see how fractured Iranian society is, though, in that moment, and how difficult it is actually to pull it all together, because there's such dissonance. There isn't much consonance, and so no matter how hard the state tries, to create a unifying message. And in fact, of course, there's this journal on Iran and America society. When you look at that, it's such a silly journal in a lot of ways, because it's all about, isn't this such a good relationship, whatever. There's a lot of history there, but there's no controversy. So I think that there was a recognition that the country is not divided, and that it could go in a number of different directions. That's what I'm left with, is that yes, there was openness, but there was very little unity and kind of people coming together. Yeah. And, I don't really have social media. So I don't have TikTok. I don't have any of this stuff. My kids, I never allowed them. Maybe they do now, but I've not let them under my watch to have social media. So I don't really know, but again, I don't like propaganda warfare. I have always said that I am a humanist, in a very broad sense, not simply as in a cultural sense. I believe very deeply in human rights all around. I don't think human rights is a Western concept. I've argued that. I wrote about that in an article back in 2000. There are many ways in which these ideas of insaniyat or adamiyat were invoked in Iranian political culture. And so my belief, my hope always is that these are the types of ideas that are somewhere, everywhere, actually ingrained, not only in Iran, but everywhere, and kind of trying to recover that somehow. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you very much. Thank you.